Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, avuidaswe, ciao, hola, whatever you say. This is the first solo episode in quite a while. I think nearly a month, 3 weeks or so. Hope you guys enjoyed the Donner Party two episode special we did with Alex. We're going to be wrapping up this solo series here within the next couple episodes, hopefully, and then we'll just get back to the guest episodes with Alex and a few other guests we have lined up. Hoping to do a new guest here soon, actually, within the next few weeks. We'll be doing a history of famous chord progressions. So, kind of loosely true crime related, which is very popular. So, hope people will enjoy that and come back and listen to that. That's kind of all the housekeeping we have for this episode. There's not a whole lot new going on. Just keeping steady. But yeah, this is episode 7 of Grant vs. Lee, The Siege of Petersburg, Part 1. And if you remember in episode 6, we covered the Battle of Cold Harbor, which had a rather uneventful conclusion. And pretty much immediately afterward, Grant starts preparing his troops to march to Petersburg, Virginia, a large sort of railroad hub / city a few miles south of Richmond. Reports show Lee had left a small force of mainly old men and new recruits numbered around 3,000 under the command of General Beauregard. Dang. Crazy, it's one of those like Southern French last names. General Beauregard is the man in command. If the Potomac could get there quick enough, the city would be easy pickings for them. So, Union General Smith was the first to make it to the outskirts of Petersburg on June 15th, 1864, with roughly 10,000 men under his command, and was reinforced by General Butler, who was already in the area, with another roughly 6,000 soldiers, bringing their total to around 16,000. He rushed to assault the thin, stretched defenses of the 3,000 Confederates, but General Beauregard had his forces withdraw before they could be caught in a real fight. This was a very smart move because once they were inside the city limits, they could tighten their defenses, and were able to hold for reinforcements. In the assault, which was more spread out, skirmishes really than a full-on attack, the Federals met surprisingly heavy resistance at a place called Baylor's Farm. During this time, General Hancock arrives, and even though he outranks Smith, he decides to leave command up to Smith, which was an error in judgment. Probably hesitant to attack further from a lack of intel, Smith delays his attack for most of the day before resuming again, then is forced to stop by nightfall. Funny thing is, he had practically won but didn't even realize it. Beauregard even later wrote in his journal that had the Union commander, Smith, further attacked, he would have captured the city. Beauregard used his opportunity, though. In the north, between Petersburg and Richmond, was the Bermuda Hundred, a massive land surrounded by water, the James River to be exact. Confederate Generals Hoke, not entirely sure how to pronounce his name, and Johnson were bottling up Union General Butler. Beauregard called them in, and by the next morning, Petersburg's defenses were manned by 14,000 Confederates. That same day, General Grant arrived on scene with General Burnside's 9th Corps ahead of the rest of the Potomac, bringing the Federal numbers at Petersburg up to 50,000. He ordered reconnaissance missions on the Confederate lines for any weak points, and since General Meade was still behind, Grant decides to put Hancock in charge of the Potomac. 3 corps, led by Smith, Burnside, and Hancock, marched in one long column on the southern lines late in the afternoon. As the Confederates were pushed back by the mass wave of Union soldiers, they would erect new breastworks behind them as they fell back, essentially leapfrogging from one hastily built log wall to another. At around 5:30 p.m., General Meade arrived, and a second attack was ordered, which pushed the Confederates back even further, yet they somehow managed to counterattack, pushing the Union forces back a bit and taking a lot of prisoners. I don't know exactly how they took care of all of those prisoners, but, that was a logistical issue for them, and not something I'm going to give myself a headache about now. June 17th held a couple more unsuccessful attacks, which infuriated Meade, who scolded his generals for not being able to take such a lightly defended city with the numbers available to them. On June 18th, the entire Potomac went into offensive. Elements of the Federal forces were able to quickly break through the first Confederate line before being brought to a standstill, and by the time the Potomac was able to come up with a way to break through, Lee had arrived with extra forces and taken over command from Beauregard. This didn't stop Meade and Grant, though, and the Potomac rushed on the Confederate trenches, only to suffer major losses and be stopped in their tracks once again. The Union 1st Maine Heavy Artillery Regiment lost 632 of its 900 men, almost wiping out the entire regiment. Numbers so high it would be easier to redisperse the survivors to other regiments than find replacements. Also here we bring up a beloved figure we haven't mentioned since Gettysburg, Colonel Lawrence Chamberlain. The same colonel who held Little Round Top at the Battle of Gettysburg, securing the Union's left flank from Confederate General Longstreet, which was one of the core reasons the Union was able to win at Gettysburg and stop Lee's invasion of the North in the first place. Oop, somebody ring my doorbell 1 second. Hope it's not the Mormons.
I believe that Satan has a hold of you. I believe that the Lord God has sent me here. And I believe that in 1978 God changed his mind about black people. Black people! You can be a Mormon who just believes.
Okay, false alarm, just an internet salesman. Dude, that scared me. Anyway, where were we? Colonel Chamberlain, the guy who held Little Round Top at Gettysburg. Well, he was also present here in this major assault. And Colonel Chamberlain, colonel at the time, along with his regiment of Maine soldiers, was one of the few able to breach the Confederate defenses, and as he pushed his men on taking many prisoners along the way, was struck down and so badly wounded his men were surprised to see him standing back up, which I don't really know how badly wounded you have to be for experienced soldiers to be surprised by the fact that you're standing up, but I'm willing to bet that's pretty bad. Probably, pretty torn up. Those who saw him thought he would drop dead the moment things calmed down, but instead of dying, he just passed out and was rushed to an army hospital to make a full recovery. While at the hospital, funnily enough, he would be promoted to brigadier general before returning to service. The dude's insane. Crazy. Anyway. Finally, the Potomac is ordered to cease all assaults. Nothing had been gained in about 4 days, and the Union had already suffered around 11,000 casualties, dead, wounded, or missing, compared to the Confederates' 4,000. The Southern Army was yet again on the defensive, which they all knew they were lethal in. They can't afford any more pointless casualties, especially with the election coming up. Any more senseless killing would be ill will towards Lincoln, who was hoping to win his second term. Grant orders Meade to have the Potomac dig in and prepare for a siege, starting what would take the next 10 months to accomplish and claim over 70,000 casualties before it was over.
Oh, that's a lot of damage!
Part of the problem facing the Potomac was that the defenses surrounding Petersburg were not hastily dug trenches and earthworks, but rather a well-planned and structured system of gun batteries that resembled small forts connected by a series of well-fortified trenches, all of which had been started 2 years prior. Grant had to get crafty, so he decided to go for the railroads leading into Petersburg themselves rather than take the actual city, at least for a start. He had 3 options: the South Side Railroad, which led to Lynchburg out west, the Weldon Railroad, which went straight to the last Confederate port in North Carolina, or the Richmond-Petersburg line, which obviously ran between Richmond and Petersburg. Grant decided to try for the Weldon and South Side, opting to use cavalry led by Wilson and Kautz, who were present in the first attack on Petersburg in a wide-ranging front, and 2 infantry corps, the 2nd and 6th, closer to home, led by Generals Birney and Wright, just a little ways to the south of their current position. To get a perspective of the Weldon Railroad, it ran directly south, away from Petersburg for several miles before heading west, while the South Side Railroad ran west away from Petersburg on the south side of the Appomattox River to avoid any confusion. I'm probably not really avoiding any confusion. I get imagining railroads and maps and troop movements in your head gets confusing. I'm the one saying it all and I'm not even keeping up. But you can look up a picture of this if you want better clarification, or you can just listen, which is what I would do, honestly. In order to reach the South Side line at all, the infantry corps would have to first take the Weldon Railroad, which was now defended by Confederate General A.P. Hill, one of Lee's most competent commanders, and who had both infantry and cavalry with him. While the infantry tried a full-scale attack approach, the Union cavalry units would take a hit-and-run strategy, hassling the Confederate railroads in a raiding run that stretched several dozen miles west before looping back from June 22nd to July 1st. While Southern forces were busy engaging the enemy far away, the mounted troopers would disassemble as much train track as they could, destroying the railroad ties and sometimes even heating the steel track themselves until they glowed red and used their horses to bend them around trees. This wouldn't totally stop the supply trains from making it to their destination, though, but could greatly slow them down. All the while, they would meet resistance led by Lee's nephew Fitzhugh Lee with his cavalry and Confederate General Barringer at Roanoke Station out west. Back at Birney and Wright's location, a few miles south of Petersburg, on June 21st, both corps are getting ready to assault Hill's location, hoping to bring a portion of the Weldon Railroad behind Union lines, rendering it unusable by Lee. At first, their assault was going well, although slow, and seemed like they might take the railroad. However, the Second Corps began creating a gap between them as they moved forward. Brigadier General Mahone of the Army of North Virginia was a railroad engineer before the war and even helped construct the very railroads he was now defending. Before they began construction, he had helped survey the land and remembered a ravine located between the 2 Union corps, large enough to hide an entire brigade as it advanced. He rapidly ushered his men through and flanked the Second Corps in the rear, taking 2 whole divisions by surprise, nearly wiping out one before night came, ending the fighting for the day. Meanwhile, the 6th Corps and Birney hadn't fared too well either, being pushed back by Hill's dug-in soldiers. On June 23rd, a brigade of Union infantry was finally able to break through and destroyed over half a mile of railroad before being chased off and digging more trenches of their own. Though they had destroyed quite a bit of rail, the line was still in Confederate hands, and by June 23rd, the new trench lines stretched for over several miles north and south. As the returning Union cavalry of Kautz and Wilson made their approach towards the Weldon Railroad at a place called Ream Station on June 29th, they expected friendly infantry to greet them. However, as you could guess, they didn't, and once they met well-prepared enemy infantry, they were quickly routed. Attempting to slip away via a back road, they were cornered by even more enemy infantry and cavalry. The Union troopers fought and ran, trying to survive the whole day, and they were barely able to get word to Meade to send aid, who sent General Sheridan with his cavalry, but even then, it would take a long time. Realizing they might get caught, the troopers burned many of their wagons and artillery to be able to move quicker. For the next few days, the Federal cavalry ran amok in what was later described as a wild skedaddle. Don't know who described it as that exactly, but somebody called it a wild skedaddle, before making it back to friendly territory on July 1st. They had managed to destroy over 60 miles worth of railroad, which took the Confederates a long time to repair, but otherwise suffered staggering casualties. Approximately 1,500 troopers, or over a quarter of their original numbers. Grant considered the whole 9-day raid a disaster. For the next 3 weeks, both sides poked and probed each other, gradually spreading their lines wider and wider, day by day, in a way reminiscent to what would be the Eastern Front in World War I. Before the siege would be lifted, the trenches surrounding Petersburg would stretch over 30 miles. There was no chance for the Potomac to break through anywhere in Lee's lines, not without unacceptable losses at least. No matter where he probed, Grant was unable to find a sufficient enough weak point to use, unless he made his own weak point. Colonel Henry Pleasants of the 48th Pennsylvania was a mining engineer, and he had an idea to help end the stalemate. Perhaps he remembered the siege of Vicksburg, and one of the methods Grant had used in trying to break through the defenses there. His plan was proposed to head command, and despite opposition from Meade, Grant greenlit the idea. They would try blowing a massive hole in the enemy lines. Again, these guys love blowing up big holes in trenches. It's had some weird fantasy. Anyway, on June 25th, Colonel Pleasant began digging a mine shaft 510 feet across from Elliott's Salient, a Confederate gun battery located on a spot of high ground on the southeastern side of Petersburg, right off of what is now the I-95 freeway. And you can actually go there now and see what's left of this crater. It's still a pretty... Don't want to give any spoilers. It's going to be next episode's topic, but the hole there is still pretty big. It's pretty deep. It's kind of wild. But there was still one issue. Lee's entire army was in place now, and even after blowing a giant hole, there was still the threat of numbers. They would need to draw as many defenders away from the site beforehand. In order to do this, Grant decided to stage a mock assault that would appear like an attempt to break through the Confederate lines, nearly 20 miles north in a spot known locally as Deep Bottom, which was on the opposite side of the wide James River as the Elliott's Salient, the point of the explosion. Leading this fake attack would be Hancock and Sheridan, with an entire corps of infantry and 2 brigades of cavalry, so it would seem real. After crossing a pontoon bridge over the James River at 3 a.m. on July 27th, Hancock and Sheridan were in place to attack Confederate trenches along Sweeney Creek and along Long Bridge Road. Sheridan went first, attacking straight across the creek, but were being hit with artillery until infantry from the 2nd Corps was able to force the southern canyons to cease. A division of Sheridan's cavalry managed to capture some high ground, but was eventually pushed back by 2 regiments of Confederate infantry. Hancock, meanwhile, held up behind a creek with a heavily defended enemy's position on the other side, and chose not to attack for the rest of the day. However, the presence of both his corps and Sheridan's troopers had the effect Grant needed, and Lee sends General Anderson to command, as well as some of Heth's infantry and even his nephew Fitzhugh Lee as reinforcements. The next day, on the 28th, Sheridan's men once again moved on the Confederates, this time hitting their left flank, before being counterattacked by Confederates who did not realize they were taking the bait. The now dismounted cavalry were waiting prone just behind the top of a ridge, and before the Southern infantry knew what happened, they were torn apart by Spencer repeaters. Those in the rear turned and ran back for safety, but Sheridan had left some men mounted as reserve, who quickly swooped in, taking over 200 prisoners. During what would be known as the first Battle of Deep Bottom, the Union actually had lower casualties than the Confederates for once, despite being on the offensive. Even though they hadn't dealt a huge blow or taken much ground, they accomplished what they were sent to do. Lee now suspected a full assault at Deep Bottom, and now most of his focus was there by July 30th, while at the same time, Colonel Pleasant's mine was now complete, and he had packed over 8,000 pounds of black powder just a few feet underneath the Confederate trenches at Elliott's Salient. Well, that is it for part 1 of the Siege of Petersburg. I'm going to try to make this like 2 or 3 parts and wrap up Lee's surrender to Grant probably in the next few episodes. At this point, kind of just trying to get this series done to move on to, more guest episodes, because, that's just seems to be best. I have way more fun with that. I mean, this solo series was kind of fun at the start, and I mean, I'm still enjoying it, but just something about actually having guests on and talking with other people, and hopefully some interviews here soon. It's just way better, and you folks seem to enjoy it more too. So definitely stick around for those, and hope you still enjoyed this one anyways. If anyone has suggestions for some maybe shorter solo series in the future, I'm all ears. You can put that in the comments. But yeah, thank you for listening, and hope you'll be back next time. And please, share this with those post it, or just tell somebody. It really does help a lot. But yeah, thanks for listening. Have a good one.